He was the son of a man who could buy silence with a flick of a ledger. Yet his ribs told a different language. They stood out beneath his skin like the bars of a secret prison. Money had bought consultants and monitors, a pediatric specialist from another state, formulas flown in on a private jet. None of it stopped him from getting thinner. Nurse Amelia Harper had been on the night shift when the call came. The fluorescent hum in the pediatric ward felt like a steady metronome to her 3 nights in a row. She'd slept sitting up in a chair next to the ward refrigerator, falling awake every time the monitors chirped. In her bag, among the take-out napkins and a battered pen, was a list of payments she could not avoid. Her sister Lily's transplant had climbed another rung on an impossible ladder of bills. There were hospital forms and phone calls, and a landlord who took the same tone as a creditor. Her scrubs were soft at the elbows from 100 small, merciful axe-ducking blankets, finding a toy at the foot of a bassinet. The stethoscope around her neck had been her grandfather's. The leather was cracked and familiar as memory. She wasn't supposed to leave the ward. She had patience. She had charts. But a voice on the other end, thin, urgent, a nanny named Maria had said 3 things that pulled her out into the rain. Please. She's tried everything. The baby doesn't keep weight on. He cries more after his night bottles. The doctors say there's nothing wrong. That phrase repeated in Amelia's head as she navigated the gated approach to the Castellano estate. The doctors said nothing was wrong. The castle of glass and stone rose up from manicured grounds, low lights carving silhouettes of palms. Security scanning was efficient and impersonal. A name on a list, a nod, a driver told to wait. Amelia's cracked phone felt suddenly very small in her hand. She signed her name on a tablet and gave a succinct explanation. Pediatric nurse. There on a private request. There was no need for the title to be argued. The name on the clipboard carried more weight than any badge. Damien Castellano met her in the foyer. He was not what the tabloids made him out to be. He wore no gaudy chains and no open shirt. He stood like someone who had grown up wearing suits before he knew how to walk. He had the same eyes as the photographs, cold and attentive at once. There was a tension there, a father's rawness braided to a commanding reserve. He stepped forward because he had been told to, but his hands were the hands of a man who had learned to count the cost of each decision. She's been through 15 specialists, Maria said the second she was in the nursery, her voice a thread of exhaustion. They keep saying different names. Metabolic disorder, absorption issue, allergies. None of them explain why he gets thin after those night feeds. Amelia looked down. Mason lace swaddled in linen that had cost more than her entire shift. Ivory bumpers, a mobile of hand-carved birds. The room smelled faintly of citrus and something polished. The baby's face was small and translucent. He did not open his eyes. He made a soft, dry noise, and Amelia noticed it was the same noise she had heard on other nights with other children. The sound of a body using more fuel than it took in. She moved in quietly, the way you move when something fragile might be startled into collapse. She listened to his breathing, to the faint clack of a monitor that could not explain what the form had told them. She ran a hand along the inside of the wrist and found a vein, and even that small search felt like trespass. Maria watched her like someone who had been braced for dismissal. You can feed him, Maria whispered. He takes mine. He cries when Natasha gives him the bottle. He gets better with me. Natasha did not look like a woman who had been told that her son was fading. She was immaculately made up. Every hair in place, as if it were armor. She hovered near the window and spoke in soft, rehearsed replies that fell flat against their rawness. There was a feature of her that unsettled Amelia. Her hands were rarely still. When she did touch Mason, it was like someone tracing a picture in a museum appreciation, but not warmth. Which bottle did you discard? Amelia asked. Maria, with hands that trembled at the memory, pointed to a small kitchen waste bin under the counter. Amelia crouched. The bin was lined with a designer bag. Even the garbage had been authenticated here. She slid in a gloved hand and felt glass. Inside, a partially empty plastic bottle lay discarded. There was a pale residue at the bottom that clung like a film. Amelia let the light from the nursery lamp pass through the bottle and watched the particles float in the syrupy formula, as if suspended in a slow-motion tide. She could have been told that she had no jurisdiction here. Doctors had been unable to pinpoint the cause, but her work had been observation long enough to know a pattern when she saw one. The baby did better with the nanny's hands and worse with the mother's midnight feeds. Small disparities formed a constellation when placed beside each other. She was, in many ways, a vessel for noticing the details others passed by. Amelia asked for a cup. Victor, the head of security, who had shadowed them from the door with a face like a stone, watched, hands folded. He had a loyalty in his jaw that was not blind. He had been employed to ensure safety in a world that made fewer mistakes than he believed. When Amelia explained she needed the bottle sample to be sent urgently to a trusted technician, he hesitated, then nodded once. He had, under his sternness, the discretion of a man who knew the value of truth when it was inconvenient. She capped the bottle and slipped it into a sterile bag she had carried in the side pocket of her Tota nurse's habit. Small preparations for small emergencies. She noted the time, the condition, everything a nurse would document. It was not the domain of physicians to deem what a nurse could not record. It was her work. They left the nursery with the bottle sealed and a hush in the foyer. Damien watched Amelia walk away with a look that trembled somewhere between gratitude and suspicion. He asked, quietly, "Do you think it's deliberate?" Amelia did not allow herself a decisive answer. Not yet. She had learned early on that certainty arrived slowly and rarely without the evidence to seed it. "I'm going to check a few things," she said instead, and it was a promise that carried her own weight. The car ride back into the city was a blur of taillights and an old single on the radio. Her mind rewound through details the way a surgeon revisits a memory of an operation, the way Natasha's fingers lingered over a bottle cap, the late-night feed schedule that Maria had recited like a litany, the small sediment that had glimmered at the bottom of the plastic. She had taken samples before. Once, a toddler with chronic diarrhea had been dismissed as failure to thrive until a careful nurse found that the formula had been diluted in a way that mattered. The parents in that case had been working 2 jobs. This was different because of the scale of protection around it. This was a house of power. At the hospital, Amelia went straight to the lab on the basement level. David, the lab technician, knew her voice without question. He had been the one to stay late on nights when results were needed to bring a family relief. He moved around centrifuges and racks like someone arranging a chessboard. They had worked together long enough to speak in shorthand. "I need this run," Amelia said, setting the sealed bag on the counter. "Toxicology screen? But start with the common things they test for, with formula." And she hesitated, aware of the limits she could not cross. "Call me. Whatever you find, call me first." David glanced at her, blue lit by the monitors, and the light in his expression tightened. "You know I will," he said. He hated the way the hospital sometimes felt like a house of overdue notices, lives stacked like invoices. He took the sample and labeled it with the time and the chain of custody Amelia had begun. It was a small ritual to preserve credibility. In a world where powerful families could make problems complicated, small procedures were shields. She walked out of the lab into the fluorescent anonymity of the night shift and breathed. It was almost 3 hours before David called. The room where he reported the first results smelled of antiseptic and coffee. He kept his voice low over the receiver. "It's not normal," he said. "There's a white particulate." The screen flagged a laxative agent at levels higher than you'd expect for an accidental exposure. He did not offer a name. It wouldn't have been allowed. He gave a clinical frame and a tone that said it was beyond a fluke. Amelia sat down on the edge of an empty patient bed and let the news land. Her reaction was not outrage at the discovery, but a narrow sharpening of focus. A laxative at a toxic level. In an infant's bottle, the possibilities were grim and had to be handled cleanly, legally, medically, ethically. She could imagine the way such an agent could cause a baby to lose weight despite properly reported caloric intake. She thought of the late-night feeds, the solitude of a mother in an empty bed, the attention that could be sought by any means, deliberate or desperate. "Do we have time to set a camera?" she asked, over the line, before she could stop herself. David's breath was audible. "If someone's doing something intentional, you'll need it. But be careful. It's their home." She already knew that. Careful had always been a modifier on her life, like the hem of a dress. She was careful enough to know how to provoke a safe enough risk. It would take Victor's cooperation. It would take trust from a household that slept behind serrated gates. And it would require her to be present without being intrusive. She was a nurse, not an investigator, but her job had taught her how to be both. Victor met her request with a frown that had history in it. The security team kept the world's edges from fraying. He could help, he said, within the bounds of his role. He would install a small, covert recorder. He did not describe its components. He only said he could have something in place by nightfall. He knew the stakes. He had seen things the Castellano family had tried to conceal. His loyalty had always been to the child's well-being first, a fact that complicated his paycheck. "You're risking your job," he said. "You're risking a lot of things." "Not more than he is," Amelia answered. That night, the nursery light hummed a steady, neutral glow. A small device sat tucked behind a carved bird in the mobile, a watchful eye hidden in the innocent geometry of the room. Amelia sat with Maria until midnight, watching the infant sleep, and ticking off possible scenarios like a nurse, reciting steps in an emergency. The house had rooms that smelled like money and a kitchen with appliances she did not recognize. The baby had toys that cost more than her rent, but there was a loneliness in the space that no object could fix. "If they could only see him in the morning," Maria murmured, voice squeezed with worry. "He'll wake and be okay for a while. Then, at night, after those feeds, he's different." They watched the cameras on the security monitor in the den where Victor made his rounds. One feed showed the nursery in soft blue. Amelia kept a pen in her hand and breathed small prayers into it. She had learned to call them notices, to a friend who got nervous when she said prayer. She felt, in her bones, how thin the future could be for a child. At 3 a.m, the nursery camera blinked. On the monitor, light flickered, and the image went black for a stretch, the length of a long minute. Victor frowned. There was nothing to say. Cameras fell out of favor like any technology glitches happened. But this was not the first time. He pulled up previous night's footage and scrolled. There, at 2:37 a.m., the stream faltered for 68 seconds. The house had that particular inflection. Everything was manicured, even when it was broken. If it glitches during a feed, how do you prove anything? Damien had asked earlier that evening, his voice low in the hallway, the kind that solicited facts like a man reviewing accounts. He lived in a world where evidence had to be impeccable, or else the absence of it would be used to bury the truth. "Then you don't have to prove it yet," Amelia had told him. "You have to collect it." The lab call and the camera glitch made a small conspiracy between them. If the sample showed a laxative that could cause the symptoms they saw, and if the camera did indeed go dark during night feeds, then motive and method might meet. Motive could be complicated by mental health, by yearning and anxiety that outstripped reason. Amelia did not believe in simple monsters. She believed in the ways people hurt those they love when they are trying to get what they think they need. When the hidden recorder captured movement later that night, the whole house breathed in. The archival footage began in the black hours where rooms go quiet and people become small. At first, it showed nothing remarkable. A slant of light across the floor, Natasha moving like a ghost through her own domain. Then the recorder caught a hand moving with a small, precise motion toward a bottle. For a moment, Amelia thought she might be seeing what she feared, the mother adding something to the formula. What followed was a whisper, and then a voice that trembled in a way that made the thing even more human. Natasha spoke in snippets, half to herself, and the camera caught a sentence that sat like a splinter. "He needs to show them he is mine. He needs them to see me." The words were hazy, raw, and not the garbled speech of a demon, but the captive confession of a woman whose loneliness had braided itself into attention-seeking harm. The device in the nursery had done what it was meant to do. It had recorded behavior and not explanation, act and not intention. Amelia watched the footage, with her chest tight and her throat a dry place. The nanny's earlier account had been enough to cause suspicion. This was a slow, dreadful confirmation. She felt the weight of the evidence like a hand on her shoulder. It was both steadying and terrifying. She called David, voiced the same hollowed-out whisper Emily had made when she read lab results, and told him they needed to corroborate the image. He agreed to prioritize a more comprehensive screening. Get everything sealed, he said. Make sure you have everyone who can corroborate the time and the chain. They were doing the small, bureaucratic things that kept big consequences, honest papers, logs, times. In a house where paranoia was a daily currency, their paper trail might be the only thing that could outvalue connections and the private interests of power. When Amelia decided to confront Natasha, it was not with accusation. She wanted confession sealed and the baby safe. She wanted to offer help that could not be refused. She wanted, in the plainest terms, to ask the woman to stop. She had rehearsed it in 100 tiny conversations she said to herself between charting vitals and turning on monitors. She would speak quietly, appeal to pain, and put the camera footage forward. She would do it in the light. She would not, if it could be avoided, become a martinet of blame. But the house is its own ecosystem. Secrets make paths where light does not go. When Amelia stood at the foot of the nursery and watched Natasha approach, there was an awkward civility in how the woman smiled. It did not reach her eyes. Her hands were fidgeting like someone who had studied how to appear composed and could not hold it when the pressure rose. Amelia, Natasha said, the name as if it were handed like a small gift. I've heard such good things. You're the nurse who came from the clinic. She moved close to Mason and adjusted his blanket as if she were performing a task along an old, secret choreography. Amelia kept her hands in hers. She had to be careful this was not a police arrest. This was an intervention in someone else's home, and she had to keep the infant's safety the first priority. Could you let me watch one of the night feeds? Amelia asked. Just one. I want to see the pattern. Natasha hesitated, a small storm inside the eyes. Women like her often had something they could explain. A nighttime ritual, an herbal measure, an insistence that only she knew how to soothe. That evening, the hush that gathered around them felt like the hold before a confession. Natasha's hand brushed the bottle cap, and for a beat, Amelia's breath caught. No, Natasha said. She said it softly, but with a finality that cracked through warmth. It's my time with him. What Amelia saw next happened so quickly, she would later try to reconstruct the sequence and find that memory, like a lens, blurred just around the edges. Natasha turned away as if returning to some other room. She walked like someone who intended to be alone, and for a second the baby lay unobserved in his crib. Amelia, who had more to lose than most, moved. It was not a noble or heroic movement in the sense people like to write about. It was a practical, direct step to preserve a child's body. She reached for the bottle, left within sight, palmed it, and found again that pale sediment clinging like a sediment of small intentions. Her heart hammered with a nurse's practicality. Document, preserve, secure. Please, she said softly to the room as if to someone who might overhear. He needs to be safe. For a moment, the house held its breath. Then a hand swift, furious snapped out from the shadow and struck Amelia. She lost her balance on the marble edge of the nursery stair. The world tipped, and a white cap spun away across the floor like a tiny moon. She felt the gravity of feet and the intimate, animal terror of falling. Her shoulders slammed into a balustrade and pain lanced up like fire. She clenched the bottle in her hand as she fell, the evidence a hard, irrefutable stone in her fist. The nursery light burned over the scene as if the house itself had become an operating room, overexposed and clinical. When she hit the bottom of the stairs, the breath left her in a sound that was not quite a cry. For a second there was only the silence of a thing that had been broken. Then voices erupted. Maria's, a terrible, keening pitch that carried panic and accusation. Victor's booming commands from the doorway. Damien's voice like a low thunder, asking, demanding what had happened. Natasha stood at the crest of the stairs, face pale but composed in that rehearsed way. For the first time Amelia saw something change in her. The practiced fragility slipped, and something raw stared back. There was no theatrical villainy, just an exhausted person whose strategies for getting attention had ruptured into violence. You shouldn't have come here, Natasha said, and her voice was mercifully small, brittle as thin ice. You shouldn't have taken his bottle. Amelia tasted metal and the sharpness of adrenaline. She pressed the bottle to her chest like a talisman. She had the recorder's memory to prove the small hand she had seen. The whisper, the powder, The bottle in her hand had been sealed and logged and noted, the room filled with a million micro-judgments. Who had trespassed? Who had saved? Who had crossed what line? Damien closed the distance between them in 2 strides. He was a man whose choices had always been decisive. He did not look for permission before acting. He held Natasha at arm's length and looked at Amelia with an expression that contained rage, concern, and something like gratitude. His voice, when it came, was level and cold. "What did you do?" he asked. Amelia's answer was not words, but a phylocopy of the hidden recorder's earliest times, a slip of paper with David's name and the lab's preliminary results. She slid both across the heavy nursery table into Damien's hands. She did not demand his belief. She only gave what she had. Damien's face changed as the file read across his eyes. A man who had measured risks for years understood the weight of what a paper could do. He looked at Natasha, then at the infant, and for the first time his reputation seemed less like a shield and more like a chain. He backed away from her with a softness she had never seen. The world of his power had no place for a fragile human confession, and he did not know how to process it without violence. "You called the lab," he said to her, voice softened. "You had someone check, did you?" Natasha's answer was a whisper and a sob all at once. "I wanted him to prove he was mine," she said. "I wanted him to need me like I needed them to need me." The confession broke like glass into the room. It was not a full explanation. It was a ragged, sorrowful fragment. It was the first human admission Amelia had wanted. It was also the first thing that made the house very, very quiet in a way that signaled danger, because confessions do not end deeds. They begin consequences. Victor moved before anyone could ask. He took Natasha gently but firmly by the arm. He did not manhandle her, not in the presence of a child, but he guided her away from the crib with a practiced, custodial tenderness. People like him knew how to hold fragile bodies without forcing them to break further. Amelia lay on the floor and breathed shallowly. Her shoulder throbbed, but the pain receded into the background because there was a pulse in every person there now. The primal need to protect a child. Damien summoned guards and a car with the speed of a man who had networks. He also called a lawyer, the kind of precaution that bent reality into legalities. His voice when he spoke into the phone was flat, a man transforming grief into action. But the house had another dimension depending on the response. Other hands could be reached. The Castellano name moved across the city's power map like an command that generated consequence. Amelia, small and bruised on the floor, understood that stepping into that orbit had consequences she could not anticipate. When Maria leaned down and took Mason from the crib in a trembling embrace, Amelia felt a knot lift from the child's tiny back. The infant was warm, and the sound he made when placed to Maria's chest was a fragile, hope-thin coo. It was not proof of innocence, and it was not a cure. It was a child seeking warmth and finding it, briefly. Damien's jaw worked as he looked at Natasha, and there was a decision being made behind his eyes, one that would not be merely private. In the past, he had let things resolve into silence when it suited him. Now, more than money or reputation, the boy's life sat in a scale he had not expected to find himself balancing. Amelia caught Victor's eye across the room. He nodded, as if to say the same thing they both knew. Do not let paperwork be a weakling. Preserve the evidence. Make sure the chain holds. He and Damien began to talk in clipped phrases about logs, about the recorded timestamp, about who could be present to authenticate what had happened. The conversation was practical, bureaucratic, and underlined by the imminence of consequences. In that exchange, Amelia recognized the dangerous calculus of power. Someone reached for a blanket and wrapped it around her shoulder. The weight was kind. Her phone lay at the bottom of the stairs, its screen fractured like a fissure. She had no idea whether the footage from the hidden recorder would be enough, or whether the lab would corroborate the image with toxic levels. She had no idea whether the inner channels of power would be marshaled to protect or to punish, but she knew with a certainty that felt like a small, warm stone that what she had done mattered. The house, which had kept its secrets under such expensive silence for so long, was awake now. Voices walked the rooms like footsteps on a tightrope. The night had shifted. Amelia knew that whatever happened next would not be tidy. She had seen things fracture and rearrange in hospitals before, families reconfiguring themselves around trauma, but never with so much at stake. As Damien stepped away to make calls, his face tightened into a hardness that unsettled Amelia. He could mobilize men and money. He could control access. The scope of what he could do frightened her. Not from a place of awe, but of responsibility, because when power intervenes, it does not always do so with innocence. It can protect the truth, or it can bury it in a more elaborate tomb. Amelia pushed on the shoulder a hand that tasted chalky with her blood. She kept hold of the bottle. She felt, in her palm, the residue of a night that had shown her how fragile truth can be. She looked up at Maria and saw the same fierce, terrified hope, as if they were both on the same raft now, floating in a sea of consequences and waiting to see whose arms would pull them ashore. Outside, beyond the bright windows and the manicured grounds, the city pulsed in indifferent light. Inside the nursery, in the hush that followed, the decision about the next step was a thing that would ripple out. Papers would be signed, phones would be dialed, men would be mobilized. Threats might be whispered in corridors that never saw a dawn. Amelia lay there, thinking of Lily, thinking of the thin banknotes and the names of organs that needed to be swapped in, like life safety parts. And she understood fully how entangled compassion could become with peril. When Damien returned, his expression had settled into something like resolve. He knelt at Mason's side and touched the infant's forehead with a gentleness that betrayed more than muscle. He did not yet have words to make sense of the woman who had harmed her child, or of the world that had allowed her to. What he did have was a determination to act. How? Amelia could not yet know. Her phone buzzed in the stairwell. A message blinked. A single line from David. Prelim results. Confirm laxative agent at dangerous level. Corroborate with camera. Her breath hitched. The evidence was tightening into a legal strap. The house had one truth it could no longer ignore. What Amelia did not foresee was the speed at which other forces would respond. Within hours, messages unpolite. Some sharp would travel through channels she did not know. A rival's name would surface in idle threats. There would be offers she could not take. There would also be men with loyalty who would stand between her and worse. She gathered herself to leave, to go to the hospital, to file the logs, to get an official chain of custody, and to make sure the recorder was preserved. Victor walked alongside her with a low, watchful gait. For a woman who had spent half her life moving within the hush of hospitals, the clamor of a mansion's safety apparatus was new. At the door, Natasha's voice stopped them. "Don't take him away," she said, small and menacing in equal measure. "You can't take him away from me." Damien's face was a shadowed mask. He turned toward her with an intensity that made Amelia take a small step back. In that moment, with the baby's monitor beeping gently in the background, Amelia felt a hand at the back of her neck. Old, human instinct steel. She was not naive about the reach of men like Damien. She only trusted, with the stubbornness of someone who had been given too few breaks, that truth would be their best protection. They left the house, with the baby in Maria's arms, with an evidence bag in Victor's secure pocket, and with a list of things to do that read like a long, formal litany. Amelia walked back into the rain and felt the night press around her like paper. Her shoulder ached, but the pain paled against the sense of a story being set in motion. A nurse with a broken phone, a battered stethoscope, a bottle in a sealed bag, and the knowledge that the powerful could no longer assume silence. Her phone buzzed again before she reached her car. A text from an unknown number read, "Be careful. Some things should stay quiet." Amelia allowed the message to slide into the folder of threats and ignored notes. She knew the city had voices like that, some loud, some thin. She also knew what it felt like to be small in a system built to favor the large. She had been that child in the orphanage, the one who learned to tally favors in the small currency of kindness. That was not a background that quit her. She started the engine and drove back toward the hospital, toward the sterile fluorescent lights she knew she could trust. She replayed the footage in her head. Natasha's whisper, the powder, the way the bottle rimmed like a tiny white moon. She thought of Mason's ribs, the way his small body seemed to be using itself up. She thought of Lily's name and the thin line that separated two children's fates. There would be cameras and lab reports and lawyers in the morning. There would also be men in the night who spoke in threats and old loyalties. Amelia had no illusions about the path forward, but she had a conviction that would not be easily shaken. That observation and documentation, small acts, repeated and preserved, could tilt even the heaviest scales. As the hospital loomed in the rain glare ahead, Amelia's phone buzzed once more. It was Maria. A single shaken line. "They're coming for you." She braked at the light, and for a second the world contracted to the size of her chest and the bottle that still lay at the center of this storm. The rain smeared the city's neon into soft lines. Her shoulder hurt. Her phone screen was cracked and useless in places. She had no armor beyond what she had always carried. A stubbornness to notice, a refusal to ignore, and a hand willing to gather evidence when others looked away. The light changed. She crossed the intersection and drove the rest of the way in a thin, watchful silence. She could not yet know who would keep the secret or who would shout it. She could not yet know the price she would be asked to pay. But when she parked under the hospital's awning, she felt something inside her that had been lit by the tiny, steady flame of obligation. She moved through the automatic doors like someone carrying a fragile thing. The hospital smelled of bleach and hope in such quantity that it made her stomach lurch. She thought of a child with ribs that read like a ledger of neglect. She thought of a mother who craved proof and found it in harm. There were no easy answers. There were only the steps she would take next. A formal report, a preserved recorder, a secure chain of custody, and the small, fierce duty to keep a child alive. When she reached the lab to speak with David and to arrange the evidence transfer, her phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a number she did not recognize. A voice spoke on the line, deep and calm, like riverbed stone. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice said. "We are watching Ms. Harper." Amelia's hand went to the bottle at her side. She did not speak, because words at this moment might be small things hurled into a wind. She hung up and felt, in the cool of the lab, something like the shape of the danger ahead. She told David the name Damien Castellano and passed him the sealed evidence bag. The lab hummed around them with the low mechanical efficiency of a place that keeps its secrets in test tubes. David looked at the bag, then at her. "I'll secure it," he said. "I'll flag it. We'll log it as urgent." She left him with the chain of custody and a list of steps to follow. Outside, the city was a smear of light and rain, and in the distance a man whose name resonated through headlines would begin to move through. Corridors of influence with a purpose she could not yet fully understand. She thought of Mason, of Natasha, and of all the small, fragile things that needed careful tending. As she walked back toward the night buses, the city seemed to rearrange itself around her, a place where power could hide things, but where a single attentive pair of eyes might unravel a harmful thread. She pressed her thumb to a photo of Lily tucked in her wallet, and for a moment the world narrowed to a single, luminous point. She would not let the thinness of an infant be accepted as fate when the evidence suggested otherwise. She had done what she could for the night. She had filed, she had preserved, she had called. For now, the truth had been nudged into the light. What no one yet knew was who would rush in with force to bury it again, or who would stand like a hand between a child and further harm. The next day would bring lawyers, cameras, calls names that could be whispered into phones and turned into threats. A shadow moved across the lab window as if someone had passed on the other side. Amelia paused. The voice on her phone had not been the only one. The city's quiet had deepened into a watchful hush. She slid her hands into her pockets and felt the small bag of evidence there like a stone. The bottle that had been the hinge of everything. For now, it was sealed, sitting in a hospital evidence locker, a thing of data and destiny. She walked into the rain, and for the first time since she had answered Maria's tremulous call, she allowed herself to be afraid. The fear sat next to something larger, an obligation that would not let her turn away. At a light, she looked back once at the hospital, a fortress of neutral lightened, thought of what could happen if the wrong people decided that silence was cheaper than truth. The night thinned into an uneasy dawn. She She pulled into the hospital lot with the dawn trimming the skyline into cold teeth. The cracked glass on her phone caught the pale light. She ran a hand over the stethoscope at her throat, as if to steady herself. It was an old ritual, like checking a talisman. Someone had said, "Be careful." Someone else had said they were coming for her. The city smelled of wet concrete and the small, urgent promise of another shift. If this is gripping you, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, she might have thought. Had there been room for anything but the logistical lists crowding her head? Preserve, document, secure, call. She pushed the thought away. This was not the hour for a distraction. The next 3 days folded into a rhythm that belonged half to procedure and half to a vigilance that made her joints ache. More calls to David to confirm Isaias. The recorder handed off to an evidence locker with signed times. Victor drafting a list of who had been in the house each night and cross-referencing it with staff schedules. Damien moved like a man whose decisions had weight and consequence. He issued orders and then sat with them, as if wondering which one of the orders would fracture into something he had not prepared for. The hospital moved in its own slow orbit. Mason was admitted under a pediatrician who accepted the chain of custody Amelia had put in motion and ordered. Suppressive care for fluids, careful caloric repletion, stool monitoring, nothing reckless. The first 12 hours were brittle with the kind of fragile improvement that can reverse without warning. Amelia stayed close. She had authority in the details nurses tend to, the way the formula was prepared, how the gloves were changed, the landscape of a diaper change. Her hands knew how to read the body's small signals the way a mechanic reads an engine cough. Between shifts she answered messages that carried a different kind of pressure. Her landlord texted for the rent. Lily's transplant fund page showed a recent donation that had sent her breath quick and hopeful. An anonymous gift large enough to move the needle. A line of numbers on her phone blinked like a promise she was not sure she deserved. Damien had messaged once, not more than a line asking if she was all right, and nothing in his tone suggested the tabloid caricature. He meant it. It was an awkward, human reach across a canyon of power, but danger did not sleep. On the 4th evening, Amelia left the hospital under a low, gray sky and headed for a friend's apartment to catch a few hours of shoot time. She kept her bag with the recorder in the trunk because habit had taught her caution evidence could not be sentimental. Halfway there, at a nearly empty intersection, headlights flashed in the rear view. A van cut across her path and a door burst open. Men moved like a single animal. Quick, practiced. Before she could register the motion, a hand grabbed the phone from her grasp and another yanked her over into a crouched, unforgiving seat. They told her little at first. Blacked out windows? A cloth over her face. The cloth smelled of engine oil and something metallic. Fingers pressed into the small of her back, shoved. Her shoulder, the one that had been bruised on the nursery stairs, flared in agony. Someone had learned how to tie hands so that wrists did not echo the protests. No bone crunch method, just constriction enough to remind a body of its limits. When the cloth came off, she found herself in a room that smelled of old bleach and damp wood. A single bare bulb swung overhead, making a staccato halo. Men with short hair and clean boots sat at a table. Their tattoos were sharp shadows against their One man smoked with the bored air of someone certain things were, by default, his currency. Across from her sat a man with a face like a stone recast in cold. He was not the one who had called her from a number with Riverbed.com. This was a subordinate, a lieutenant with eyes careful around the edges. He spoke with the practiced contempt of someone who had been given a script to deliver. "You spoke to Castellano," he said. "You brought trouble?" Her voice was dry. "I'm just a nurse." "Oh yes," he said, as if the word tasted odd to him. A nurse who took a bottle and sent it to a lab. People like you cross lines. They brought a large man in who introduced himself by name as one of Ivan Volov's lieutenants. The name carried weight in the room. It was as if saying it made the beaten air colder. The lieutenant tapped an old scar on his cheek as he described demands that smelled like extortion in the way they were made to sound like negotiation. "Your gambit put a family at risk. Vulov wants this settled. He says he will call off actions if the matter is quieted. If Castellano comes to certain terms and steps back, the family can continue. If not," he let the sentence hang like a threat. Amelia kept her hands still. There were a dozen practical actions running through her mind. The recorder in the hospital locker, the lab's numbers, Victor's loyalty. But in this room, logic had an elastic quality. The reach of men like Vulov could stretch into places that paperwork could not cover. "Take me to him," she said, voice steadier than she felt. "I will tell Vulov to stop." The men laughed. One of them leaned forward and put a palm against his chest. "You think you speak for Castellano? You think you get to bargain? No. We make demands." They wanted leverage. They wanted to take away the thing that mattered to Damien if he refused a deal. Amelia understood the calculus quickly. They wanted to swap her life for Natasha's freedom. In their mind, it was symmetric. In hers, it felt like crooked math. In a dim hallway, the lieutenant unfurled a photograph. It was Damien and his son at a park, the boy wrapped in a matching knit hat. The lieutenant's eyes softened for a breath, showing Amelia a different angle. Men like this had family in their own inventory charts. But the softness did not linger. He snapped the photo back like a closing chamber. "Tell Castellano to hand Natasha over," he said. "Tell him to keep the family safe." Amelia shook her head. "You don't trade a child's safety for a grudge." The lieutenant's smile did not reach his eyes. "Then we teach you how compliance works." The door burst open before the lesson began. Victor had come with a small contingent, an echo of the loyalty he wore like a coat. He moved through the warehouse with a purposeful economy, 2 quick shots in the air not to harm, but to buy a sliver of time, and men who had been watching their 30 seconds now had to decide whether to run or fight. Shots rang out. Not cinematic ones, not the kind meant to slice a soundtrack and slow breath. The world reduced into sound and rubber, and men moving like birds pressed to panic. Amelia found herself grabbing for anything solid and pulling her body down. She heard Victor shout her name. His voice was a rope through the thick. The room split. Some men fled, bodies hitting the wet pavement with the dull thud of a life, making a messy exit. A clear-headed, terrible fight unfolded in the corner where 2 men used fists and knives as if they were practicing a grim ritual. The lieutenant tried to make a break for it and was intercepted by a man with Damien's dignity and a gun in his palm. Amelia saw movement that time slowed into sharp-edged, clean images. The silhouette of a car slamming into a post, the bright of a muzzle, a man falling against a crate where beams of dust speckled his shirt. Ivan Volov's name had been invoked like an incantation. Now consequences were answering like an echo. She was pulled away, not by the police, but by hands she had grown to recognize. Damien's face was a hard plane of grief and fury. He smelled of smoke and cold metal, somehow clean and ruinous at once. The damage in his eyes made the sharp tendons of his face tremble. "You are alive," he said, as if the past few hours had boiled down into those words. He looked at her as if he could read the ledger in her rib cage and know what debt she carried. "You were stupid," he said, and the word held both accusation and gratitude. He did not ask who had come for her. He mobilized around her like a shield. They retreated to a safe house the way a cast retreats to the hospital after an operation. Victor and a few remnants of his old guard checked her for injuries, tallying bruises and listing what could wait to be seen by a professional. One of the men pressed an ice pack to the flank she had slammed against a crate. Damien stayed like a statue at the edge of the room and then, when the adrenaline peeled back, retreated into a private space where his body could not be inspected by strangers. The news began to ripple outward without permission. Phones with captured images of the warehouse, of the van, of the men pulling off in the night, moved through channels like a virus. People who survived on information adjusted their angles. The story could become an ugly arithmetic. Amelia, a nurse, Mason, a child, Vulov, a rival Vulov's, men killed in retaliation. Each head counted a cost. Each message was a currency. For Amelia, the immediate thing was that she had survived. The bruise across her shoulder set like a coin. Her wrists were raw. The fear had settled into a quiet, dead fatigue. She realized, a body that would have to carry another night's sleep to recover. They did not, in the end, give Natasha freedom. The negotiation was not a simple swap. The men who had acted on Volov's instructions were dealt with through a violent, private calculus that costs more than any ledger could tally. In the aftermath, Volov himself was killed in an altercation the papers would frame as a confrontation between rival factions, their words, careful, measured. Within the world of men like Damien, things that might otherwise be negotiated slid into bloody finality because the balance of threats was not level. The police did come, in the slow, public way institutions do, after the immediate rescue had been secured. Some of the men involved were arrested, others vanished into the city's lean gray underbelly. The footage that had mattered the recorder in the nursery, the lab reports were now bricks in, a foundation that could not be knocked over by rumor. Damaged men were tended and moved into anonymity. Amelia was given the option to make a formal complaint against Volov's affiliates. She chose to collaborate with investigators as best she could, understanding the complicity she might invite by doing nothing. Natasha was taken into custody within days. The arrest was careful and professional. She did not scream theatrically. She walked as if tired, almost relieved to be removed from the pressure she had been wearing, like an ill-fitting coat. In the processing room, her eyes emptied into a quality of human exhaustion. She answered questions in a low, trailing voice and then, under professional advisement, was placed in psychiatric custody pending evaluation. The doctors called it what it likely was, a factitious disorder imposed on another Munchausen by proxy. In older terms, the clinical label landing over the scene like a plain surgical cap. The phrase did not make her any less responsible for what she had done. It described a pathology that needed evaluation and treatment. In private, clinicians spoke of the thin line between attention-seeking and harm, about the ways trauma and loneliness could shape a warped hunger for attachment. The language softened something without excusing it. There was a legal process now. There were papers and custody protocols, in the eyes of a million commentators who could never fully understand the interior story. Mason's weight began to climb. It was slow, a relief measured in ounces. The hospital set him on a careful plan. Restore electrolytes, treat complications from chronic laxative exposure, observe for long-term GI sensitivity. He slept with a steadier breath. Maria, who had been beside him through nearly every step, watched the numbers like a priest watching a crucible. Amelia, whose authority had been inherently nursing, charted feeds and recorded stool collections and noted the subtle shifts that numerals sometimes failed to capture, the way his fingers curled around a stray blanket, the little widenings of the eye when someone spoke gently. At night, she lay awake in a small rental and listened to the city as if it were a patient whose heartbeat she could not relax. Her phone pinged with messages from Damien, updates about the legal channels he was opening. An offer of help for Lily's transplant fund that arrived with no fanfare, but a clarity that implied more than money. He wanted to ensure the child he had called my son would have a team of people around him that stretched beyond the castle. She accepted, warily, because the gift was not only a check, it was a change in the geometry of their relationship. When the lab released a Fuller report, it confirmed what David had suspected. Repeated exposure to a laxative agent at levels inconsistent with accidental contamination. The pattern of exposures, the times logged against feedings, the cameras captured motion together, they knitted a narrative that had weight beyond rumor. David's face, when he handed Amelia the printout, was a soft, exhausted thing. He had been the keeper of white space on suspicion, and that role had a cost. Legal avenues took a slow, bureaucratic shape. The DA's office opened a case. Attorneys sifted through a chain of custody forms, camera logs, and witness interviews. Damien supplied everything he could without absolving himself. He was not interested in a public spectacle, but he also wanted the truth to be vetted and acknowledged. Amelia met with investigators and prosecutors, her statements precise and careful, the antithesis of the dramatized accusations the papers might have created. Her role was not a hero stage, it was a ledger of facts and small, repeated actions. Natasha's arraignment was a scene of muted fury and sorrow. The prosecutor read the charges: endangerment, administration of a harmful substance, and other counts that matched the evidence. A psychiatric evaluation was ordered. The duty of the court was to balance justice with the understanding that mental illness shaped actions in ways the law was not always equipped to unravel neatly. She was charged and ordered to hold for evaluation. The phrase left the public wanting a definitive verdict and gave clinicians the time to study what had transpired inside a fractured mind. Damien's choices after the dust settled reflected a complexity that made newspaper columns stumble. He did not use his wealth to bury the incident or to vanquish everyone connected. Instead, he redirected his money in a way that tested his own reputation. He announced, privately at first, and then publicly, a foundation focused on pediatric care for underserved children, an effort to fund long-term pediatric treatments and to offer support where the system failed. People in his circles scoffed. Men who lived by tradition found his turn toward public philanthropy puzzling, a misstep. But to those who watched the slow shift, it read as a man adjusting the currency by which he measured himself. He also made good on a private promise. Lily's transplant fund received a donation that was substantial enough to secure a spot on a transplant list at a leading center. Damien did it without headlines. He sent the check and moved on, arranging the logistics of the surgery with the pragmatic efficiency of a man who had long been used to making difficult arrangements. Amelia stood at the edge of these choices like someone watching a river redirect. She did not trust the easy alchemy of money into healing. She had seen what bills could buy and what they could not. But the donation did more than shift balances. In the small, private way of kindness that the rich sometimes overlook, Damien set up a trust fund for Lily and arranged for Amelia to have assistance through recovery after the kidnapping. That assistance was both practical and symbolic. It implied a recognition from a powerful man that her life had weight beyond the hospital shift. Recovery for Amelia was not linear. The bruise on her shoulder left a phantom ache. The fear had periodical returns, a ghost that grasped at the back of her throat when she closed her eyes. She went to a counselor the hospital recommended, an unflashy woman with a steady gaze who had a way of translating the body's memory into a vocabulary that made sense. Amelia learned to build small rituals that stilled the panic. A 10-minute walk at dusk, checks to make sure her phone was charged and contacts were set, a call to Maria before bed. She learned the language of boundaries and the thin, patient work of outliving an attack. Lily's surgery went as well as such procedures could. The days before the operation were dense with waiting and a strange, sterile hope. Amelia sat in the pre-op room, holding Lily's small hand and thinking in the inventoried way nurses do: anesthesia, donor compatibilities, ICU flow. People prayed according to the faith they had and some according to the faith they had lost. When Lily came out of surgery, groggy and fragile, Amelia kept a vigil until a doctor told her the word everyone wanted to hear: stable. Tears came small and syrupy. Not like the sudden theatrics of film, but like the soft leak of a canal that had run long. Months staggered by, in the direction of repair. Mason gained weight under watchful eyes. His cheeks filled and the space between his ribs moved toward normalcy. Natasha, after evaluation, was admitted to a psychiatric facility for intensive treatment. Reports from clinicians were careful. She presented with a severe psychiatric disorder that had manifested in dangerous behavior toward her child, underpinned by unresolved trauma and a desperate need for attention that, untreated, had turned destructive. Her treatment plan involved therapy, medication, management, and long-term supervision. The court-appointed guardianship proceedings ensured Mason's immediate safety while long-term custody questions were deliberated. In the meantime, Maria remained a constant presence, and Damien, his own emotional architecture shifting, opted for custody measures that sought the child's stability. The city's tabloids tried to stitch the narrative into neat columns. Nurse becomes savior. Mafia boss redeems himself. Mother is monster. Amelia refused the simple parts. In interviews she gave, she spoke like a nurse and not a celebrity. Facts and compassion. A refusal to strip Natasha of her humanity, even while condemning the harm she had done. Mental illness should be treated, she said in one brief segment that lit up 1,000 comment threads. People offend. People need care. We can protect the vulnerable and still insist on accountability. Her stance made some uncomfortable. It also created a small network of support from clinicians and advocates who wanted to reform the ways child protection and psychiatric evaluation coordinated with law enforcement. Damien, for his part, leaned on the lawyers who could do him good, and on the activists who could help marshal resources for families in crisis. He paid legal fees not to silence but to enable a cleaner process, a public acknowledgement that power had been part of the problem, and that power could be made to stand behind a solution. Weeks blurred into months. Amelia returned to the hospital floor at her own pace. Each shift a field where she could mark the world with the small kindnesses that stitched a day together. A quiet hand on a parent's shoulder, the exact angle to tape a bandage, the patience of a bedside that listens. The work grounded her. She made a small mural with the children's therapy team, bright paper fish for a pediatric corridor, and in the corner wrote, in tiny letters, the name Lily. It was not a boast, it was a map. The foundation Damien set up structured itself slowly. He insisted that it be run by professionals with a track record, public health experts, pediatricians, nurses. Amelia was offered a seat on the advisory board, a practical role that married her frontline experience with the resources to do good at scale. She accepted with a caution that had become part of her posture, that no donation should replace the messy work of systems, but that funding could buy breathing room for systems willing to change. There were arguments about optics. People wondered whether money tied to a man with a criminal past could be cleansed by charity. Others argued that the child who needed a transplant did not care for moral calculus. He needed organs, and those organs required funding and quiet logistics to make happen. The foundation's first grant went to a pediatric outreach program in a borough hospital that had seen too many cases fall through the cracks. It was a small start, but the families who used the clinic called it a lifeline. Amelia and Damien's relationship grew like two trees planted on adjacent hills, too close to deny influence, far enough apart to recognize difference. They did not rush into a romance the way a movie might script it. Their closeness began with small things. Damien learning how to hold a crying baby without looking alien. Amelia teaching a guard how to change a feeding tube with a steady hand. Both of them sitting in a small waiting room with coffee that tasted of burnt hope and talking like people who had outlived an immediate danger. Damien's personality changed in ways that were visible but not theatrical. He closed certain doors, redirected investments away from enterprises that skirted lines, and began to fund legitimate opportunities, after-school programs, pediatric research grants, a community center that offered counseling services. He hired compliance attorneys. He met with journalists once, expressing remorse without melodrama. He did not change the fact of his past. He simply bent his future into a different shape. The world continued to hum with both cynicism and hope. Rumors abated, then shifted to news stories. In hospital corridors, people spoke of the nurse who had noticed a bottle in a bin and would notice many other things as life moved on. Maria returned to her duties with a steady, weary pride. Victor kept to the edges, a guardian who preferred to be a human presence rather than a headline. David curated the lab's protocols, so the chain from bottle to report was tighter and cleaner. The small net of people who had acted the way good people act was larger now. One autumn morning, months after the first night that had tilted the world, Amelia walked into the hospital and found Mason in a crib by a window, cheeks dimpled and lively. He reached for a past toy with a vigor that had not been there before, and when she picked him up he clung with the fierce, uncomplicated trust of a child who had been kept safe. Maria, who had been his steady in the chaos, watched them from the doorway and smiled with a relief so complete that it seemed to change the light in the room. That afternoon, Damien came by with a small, careful bag of pastries, the kind that smelled of sugar and apologiande. Sat in a chair that had been waiting for him since the beginning. They talked about logistics and about a summer plan for the foundation's pediatric outreach. They talked about Lily's next checkup and about the possibility of taking the children to a park that was neither a fortress nor a front. Conversation slipped towards certain fragile intimacies, like a river finding a new bed. He asked about Lily. She told him small stories about a sister who loved to draw constellations on the back of hospital forms. He told her about the father he had been in private. Moments that did not make tabloids because they were small and honest. No one made promises they could not keep. They made, instead, practical arrangements for family dinners and for someone to call when a midnight feeder needed a watchful hand. There was a day, in late winter, when the hospital's pediatric floor threw a small party for families who had been through especially rough years. There were paper crowns and cake, and a table where children made handprints to be glazed and hung on the wall. Mason finger-painted a lopsided sun. Lily, up from recovery, and still delicate, smeared frosting on Amelia's cheek, and then giggled, a sound like a small bell. In the corner of the room, Damien watched them all with an expression that belonged to a man whose account ledger had been rearranged by love and responsibility. He stepped forward then, not for a spectacle, but because there were things you did once your priorities had unavoidably corrected. He knelt to offer a small wooden train to Lily, and then, with a directness that startled both Amelia and the assembled staff, he took her hand. There was no grand proclamation. He did not lay down an empire. He made a small, very human request. Would she consider joining him at a foundation meeting the next week? Would she consider, in time, being part of a family? The phrase sounded heavier than it was meant to be, because families are heavy with history and debt and love and obligations. Amelia answered with the honesty that had become her currency. She said she needed time. She said she wanted to know what his promises meant in practice before she accepted them in heart. He smiled like a man whose whole life had been learning how to wait. Months later, in a quiet corner of an outpatient ward, after Natasha's first long-term evaluations had been processed and her clinical team had recorded slow but visible engagement with therapy, Amelia visited her. The room smelled of lemon and clinical lavender. Natasha looked thinner. Her eyes, previously practiced and rehearsed, floated in a softer kind of presence. She looked up at Amelia with an expression that was not pleading with performative guilt, but with a raw, human bank of grief. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said. "Not now." Icy faltered. The words were small and stung with self-note. "I wanted to be seen. I didn't know how to be anyone but loud." Amelia sat beside her, not as judge, but as witness. She held a child's trauma in her hands, but recognized a person who needed therapy and a longer road to recovery. "You will need help," Amelia said. "This is where it starts, help and accountability." They both knew the truth of it. Things did not resolve cleanly. Natasha would need long-term work and supervision. The law would do what courts do. Clinicians would do what clinicians do. The city's appetite for narrative would swirl elsewhere. Years later, when memory had softened edges but not the bone of what had happened, Mason toddled around a living room that smelled faintly of lemon and laundry. He stumbled into Amelia's knees and grinned like an untroubled sunburst. He said a small, clear word mangled by toddler speech that sounded like mama. Amelia's heart did a curious thing. It stumbled, then steadied. Damien, watching from the armchair with the grave dignity he had always worn, laughed softly and wiped a hand across his face the way men do when emotion finds them in a private room. The house was not a castle anymore. It was a place of dim lamps and the sound of a child learning grammar. Neither of them pretended their world had been cleaned of sin. Damien's past was a gravity he could not undo, but he had undertaken a slow sequence of changes. He had invested in legitimate enterprises. He had restructured his companies to limit harmful channels. He had paid legal and social debts in ways the public could scrutinize. He continued to meet with his counsel. He continued to live with the reality that power must be balanced with responsibility. Amelia took a step forward into family without declaring ownership. She signed donations in names and also in deeds, volunteering in the foundation's pediatric clinics and leaning into the hands-on work she loved. She insisted on a board that included people from neighborhoods that were not like the one in which she had once counted rent notices. She pushed for funds to be used for real social support. Home visits, caregiver support, mental health resources, things that might catch the edges of tragedies before they turned catastrophic. They held a small ceremony 1 year after Mason's admission to the hospital. Not a wedding and not a vow under a cathedral, but a gathering in a community center the foundation had funded. There were families who used the clinic as neighbors, there were staff who had long been on overtime, and there were children who brought paper flowers and songs. No cameras, just people. Natasha did not attend. She was in a treatment program. The day was not about redemption as a final absolution. It was about work being done with an eye toward the future. At the end of the day, as sun thinned into dusk, Amelia stood by a window with the tiny hand of a toddler curled in her fingers, and thought about the strange arc that had turned a night shift, a bottle in a bin, and the worn leather of an old stethoscope into something larger. Her life had been pushed into a new geometry by danger, and by an inexorable moral force. The duty of care. There would be other nights, other small emergencies to tackle. The world did not stop being dangerous. But people had shown up, nannies like Maria, being brave enough to call, lab techs like David doing the painstaking work of evidence, security men like Victor, walking the line between loyalty and conscience. Amelia thought of the orphanage that had taught her to find steady kindness in small things, and of Lily drawing constellations on hospital forms. She thought of Mason's thin ribs once, like the bars of a secret prison, and how those bars had softened under careful hands and medical attention. Damien placed an envelope on the table earlier that week, small, folded, and practical. Inside it was a set of documents transferring a portion of his funds into a trust that would guarantee Lily's future and the foundation's long-term operation. It was not a grand gesture designed for tabloids. It was work. He also offered her a ring later, not as a trophy, but as a quiet promise, not to erase his past, but to choose a future together that would be bounded by rules both he and she would accept. She did not say yes that afternoon. She accepted, instead, the chance to see where trust might go, to test it in 1,000 tiny ways over the years. Months thickened into years. Amelia continued to work as a nurse. She slept differently now, sometimes imperfectly, but with a sense that her presence could still be a force. She taught other nurses to notice the things that did not add up, to question the lineage of a bottle or the schedule of a feed. She argued for hospital protocols that better coordinated with child services. The foundation funded pilot programs that put mental health support into homes before crises and some small studies suggested fewer children being brought into acute care for suspicious weight loss. It was not a miracle, and it did not fix everything, but it moved the needle. On a spring morning years later, a small party gathered in a modest garden. There were children chasing each other in grass that had not known such noise, their laughter flinging the air into bright confetti. Mason, older and robust, picked dandelions and handed them to Lily like small coronets. Amelia stood with Damien, their hands shading a light she did not think would be permanent but accepted as steady for that day. A woman from the psychiatric clinic where Natasha had undergone treatment stood at a distance and smiled in a way that suggested long roads traveled and some degree of healing. Natasha lived her life, inside boundaries and therapy. She wrote letters that were read in careful family sessions. She did not erase the harm she had done. She engaged with clinicians, acknowledging in fits and starts the damage of her acts. Her path was a narrow and difficult work of professional and personal repair, the kind that might never fully satisfy those she had injured, but that nonetheless intersected with discrete steps toward responsibility. When the afternoon softened to a long and generous dusk, Mason climbed into Amelia's lap and rested his head against her chest. The inarticulate word came again from a toddler who had long learned the grammar of safety. "Mama!" She let herself answer the small, true joy it gave her without apology. Outside, the city continued its same metropolis that had swallowed gossip and lit its front pages with a story for a day. The danger, the greed, the thin-handed tradespeople of harm hadn't dissolved, but a pattern had been altered. A small, persistent network of people had done what good people often do: noticed, documented, persisted. They had not cured the world. They had made one child's life safer and fashioned a place where the cost of silence had been raised. If you're still here, thank you for listening. If this story moved you, like and subscribe for more stories that honor the quiet courage of people who notice.